on the Feast of All Saints this week, I've been thinking a lot about the concept of thin places. Do people know do you know about the idea of thin places? Megan, what's a thin place? Sorry. Yeah, so a thin place comes out of, like, the idea of Celtic spirituality. Sorry for putting you on the spot. You're great. But it is the idea of places where the border, the barrier between heaven and earth is thin, right? Places where we experience that sense of the otherly, the divine, breaking into our world. And we all may have different understandings of what those types of thin places are, right? A couple of years back, actually, maybe more than a couple of years now, it's been a while. I've been here for a while now, I guess. Mark, Chaplain Bragan, and I at Kenyon did a film series of students from different religious identities talking about where they felt spiritually connected on campus. And my favorite one was the student who talked about Pierce, the dining hall, and feeling connected to God in the conversations that they were having with their classmates over meals, right? And for me, often the places where or even the spaces where I will feel connected are where I can feel the sort of weight of generations of prayers. I suppose there is a reason that I was a medievalist at one point in my life. And I remember, I'll throw this out for Professor Surface, I remember back when I was in seminary, my parish did a reconstruction of a medieval English Latin Mass. And it was one of the most profound spiritual experiences of my life to pray and perform a liturgy that it felt had that weight to it and could feel that thinness and that connection with generations and centuries, connected to the saints going back so far. And I think that's a powerful way of understanding sainthood and what we are celebrating and what we are reflecting on in this Feast of All Saints, right? We go back and forth all the time, and I know this drives some of our Catholic students, Elizabeth, crazy in dealing with our Episcopalian fuzziness around the concepts of saints. What are saints? How do we define saints? What is a capital S saint versus a lower s saint? What are we even talking about? And one way that I think is helpful for us approaching this idea of sainthood is to consider saints, those people, whether the capital S saints or the lowercase saints of our lives, as the people who reveal that sense of thinness between heaven and earth. Those people through whom we see the reality of heaven breaking into this world. And I think it is important for us to maintain that sort of heightened theological sense of All Saints' Day. Right? This is one of the principal feasts of the church. I break out my fancy cope. We bring out the incense. And I think this is where I'm going to get on one of my soapboxes that perhaps the Catholics will appreciate. I'm sorry, I enjoy calling you out. But we have often conflated the feasts of All Saints' Day on November 1st with the Feast of All Souls on November 2nd, right? All Saints' Day is when we celebrate, again, the saints of the church. All Souls' Day is when we remember all those who have departed this life in the complexity of human experience, shall we say. And I think the way that we have typically now come to conflate All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day by sort of celebrating them both mushed together the Sunday after November 1st and 2nd, often leads to us seeing All Saints' Day through a very human lens, right? Which is good and fine and important, right? I think to remember those who have gone before us, those who have been meaningful in our lives, to remember the very human ways that we reflect the love of God to one another. But I also think that it's important to hold to something that is mystical and ineffable, as we hear in our collect this morning about the nature of the saints and the communion of saints themselves. And all of our readings throughout the 3 different lectionary cycles find different ways of approaching this call to reflect upon the saints. And today in our reading from Matthew, we have one of the texts that might, it might be easy to look at as one of the most just straightforward, the Beatitudes, right? One of the most familiar texts probably in all of the New Testament, a common text to be read often at funerals. Those who were at Bob's funeral yesterday would have heard it read and reflected on really powerfully. And it can be easy to sort of reduce the Beatitudes merely to a list of virtues. And a shout out to Pastor Christopher at Gay Street Methodist. He, I think, resisted that temptation very powerfully and gave a great reflection on that nature of blessedness. But it can be very easy to sort of look at the Beatitudes as a lens of virtues that we are meant to emulate, of an ideal that we are meant to uphold and probably will inevitably fail at. But I think there's something much more interesting happening in the Beatitudes, and especially the play on sort of time and tense in them. We hear this sense of present blessedness in tension with future blessedness. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And I wonder if the Beatitudes themselves, far more than being just a list of virtues, is actually a way of expressing that sense of thinness in how we understand a saint, someone who conveys indeed and embodies the blessedness of God. Someone whose life now holds that tension of the future reality, the future hope of resurrection, perfect communion with God and with the whole fellowship of saints in the messiness now of this present life. There is a both and to the blessedness now and in the world to come. And I think holding to this idea of saints as embodying that sense of thinness between heaven and earth, between the human and the divine, allows us to avoid some of the great sort of traps and pitfalls of commemorating the saints, which is holding the saints up, however we want to understand who saints are, holding them up as some ideal of individualistic Christian perfection and righteousness that we are meant to aspire to and will inevitably fail at. And instead, I think what sainthood, holiness is about reflecting, opening a window to a reality that we are invited to participate in, to share. That reality of how God's love and presence and perfect communion is made manifest. think it is important on this All Saints' Day that we don't think about the saints just as a collection of individuals, but indeed as a communion, where the line between heaven and earth is thin, but our lines and walls and barriers between one another is thin as well. And we are invited to live into that communion fully and powerfully now. I want to end on that point with just a brief reflection over the last couple of days and a powerful interaction that I had. So some of you know that I've been very drawn into discussing the current just tragedy beyond all words happening right now in Israel and Palestine, particularly in Gaza. And I have spent a lot of time, I feel particularly convicted and called to talk about and uplift the voice of Palestinian Christians who are largely erased from the conversation, particularly by many Christian churches here in the West, right? They are just not, they are completely sidelined and ignored by those who should be their siblings in faith. And I have spent a lot of time sharing sermons, reflections, interviews, letters from Palestinian Christians online. And there is one pastor in particular, a Lutheran pastor in Bethlehem named Munther Isaac, whose book I read, spoiler, we are going to be reading it as a parish in Advent, so look ahead to that. And I've read several of his sermons and interviews, and his words are powerful and challenging and convicting. And he offers such a powerful voice of God's presence among the oppressed and the marginalized, and such an incredible voice of persistent faithfulness in his call to be heard by the Western Church. And I discovered a couple of days ago that he had an online presence and in fact started following me on Instagram and Twitter. So I followed him back. And then out of the blue, I got a message from him on Instagram yesterday just saying, thank you. Thank you for speaking for us. We hear it. We appreciate it. And it was probably one of the most humbling messages I've ever received. And it's very easy to think of, fall into the trap with social media as this, at best just shouting into a void that sometimes shouts back, or at worst a somewhat narcissistic performance. But I think in that moment, what can be a vehicle for so much toxicity and hatred and negativity became a way of manifesting that thinness between the Palestinian Christian community in Bethlehem and a random Episcopal priest in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, sharing their posts online. And such a powerful manifestation to me of what the communion of saints is and should be. Both a conviction for us to stand in solidarity with one another, to embrace that thinness and the communion that we share, and also such a powerful encouragement to us that we are not alone in our faith and we are not alone in the witness for Christ and for the ways that heaven can indeed break into our world. And I pray that we may give thanks today for the communion of saints in all of its multiplicity, and to live into both the calling and the hope of the saints. Amen.